Hey y'all, it's Heel Heat time.
Hi everybody and welcome to Heel Heat, and this is an episode of It Came From the Network. Now, It Came From the Network is basically the weird, wacky, odd, and sometimes just downright bad stuff that you can find on the WWE Network, all for the low price of $9.99. Everybody knows the price point at this time. On this episode, we're reviewing WCW Starrcade 1994. Let's jump right into it. Unfortunately, Starrcade 94 didn't have as much emphasis to jump into the show as I have to jump into this show. For the first 11 minutes, and I counted it because it was really odd, the first 11 minutes of Starrcade, we seen backstage promos and hype packages. For Starrcade, at one point WCW's equivalent of WrestleMania, predating WrestleMania as the mega show in wrestling, the one that actually originally was called the granddaddy of them all, and the first 11 minutes of it, we get promos. I mean, I don't get it. It doesn't make sense. I digress. We'll move on to what we're going to say. First match of the night, we have Big Van Vader versus Hacksaw Jim Duggan for the U.S. title. And believe me when I say this, folks, there's two really good matches on the show, and this is one of them. And that's surprising. Duggan, good draw, good talent, very limited in his ring. This is probably the best of his WCW run matches. Vader picks up the win, wins the U.S. title. He's already the number one contender, which comes into play, and it's something that they mentioned ad nauseum during the match. But just a good match, a good hard-hitting match between two guys that probably shouldn't have had a good match, to be honest with you. Next up, we have Jean-Paul Levesque. That's right, folks. The guy that would go on to become Triple H, Hunter Hearst Helmsley, in one of his original gimmicks in WCW as a French snob blue blood, going up against Alex Wright, Das Wunderkind. Basically, at this time, it was the new up-and-coming talent of WCW getting a chance to shine on the big show. You can tell both of them are still really young and still really learning the business. Alex Wright picks up the win. About a 15-minute match. Not a bad match, just you could tell they didn't quite understand. Levesque was nowhere near the wrestler he would become as Triple H. Alex Wright, who probably catches a lot of flack because of the silliness of his gimmick, was a lot better wrestler than people give him credit for. Unfortunately, this was a little bit early in his career, and the match just seemed to plod on, and there was a lot of mat wrestling that kind of drew the fans out of it, in my opinion. Next up, we have Arn Anderson versus Johnny B. Bad for the TV title. The reason this one's interesting is because it was advertised, and even on the beginning of the show, it should have been the Honky Tonk Man versus Johnny B. Bad. Depending on what stories you believe, Honky Tonk Man either quit or got fired during the night of the show, supposedly over pay. They slid in Arn Anderson. Arn Anderson and Johnny B. Bad put on a good match. These two guys together put on several good matches. They're kind of in this weird time capsule of WCW where WCW had some really bad shows and pay-per-views. So the matches are kind of forgotten. Of course, Johnny B. Bad isn't looked at with any reverence as Arn Anderson is, so it's nowhere near the highlight of Arn's career. Probably one of the highlights of Johnny B. Bad, so a good match. Johnny B. Bad picks up the win, as it should have been, with something that was just thrown together probably literally 10 minutes before they shot him out there. Now, next up, we have Harlem Heat versus the Nasty Boys. This was interesting, going back and seeing and remembering Booker T as a heel and how good of a team Harlem Heat was. I don't think the chemistry with Harlem Heat and the Nasty Boys was quite there yet. I've seen other matches that they've had together that were a lot better. I thought it was a good match, an okay match. Just, it didn't seem to click all the way. The Nasty Boys pick up the win by disqualification. Like I said, I just don't, it didn't all the way hit on all cycles for me. I thought it was just almost, I'd like to say, a lethargic match. Like maybe they toured around a lot just before doing this. I don't know what the reasoning is. Just didn't hit it for me. Next up is a match that probably should have never happened anywhere at any time. Billed as one of the three main events. Kevin Sullivan versus Mr. T. Yes, WWE Hall of Famer Mr. T. A-Team star Mr. T. Rocky 3 star Mr. T. At this point in wrestling, we're at least 7 years past Mr. T at the height of his popularity. And I know he was brought in to do the Hall of Fame and all that, and it's 20 years past his popularity, but that's a different story. This was WCW trying to emulate WWE, WWF at the time, and bring in a star from outside world. However, the star they brought in was past his prime, was no longer a draw. Nobody tuned in to see Mr. T. Nobody cared about Mr. T at this point. I mean, let's be realistic. There's nothing to the match. David Sullivan, who was kayfabe Kevin's brother, dressed up in a Santa Claus outfit. They were feuding at the time. He causes distraction. Jimmy Hart puts the megaphone, hits Sullivan with the megaphone, and puts the megaphone in Dave Sullivan's bag. Dave Sullivan hits Kevin Sullivan with it. Mr. T gets a pin. Mercifully, a short match. Again, a match that should have never ever happened in a million years. After we've seen WrestleMania 1 and 2, how limited Mr. T was in the ring, who would have thought that 7, 8 years later, they'd trot him out again? But there he was. For everybody's, I guess, enjoyment. I mean, I guess at the time there was still the little kid in me that remembered growing up watching Mr. T, but I didn't want to see him in a wrestling ring. I'd like to see him on Where Are They Now? And, I mean, it just didn't make sense to me. It'd be the equivalent of, say, I don't know, George Costanza from Seinfeld showing up on Raw to do a match. It just doesn't make sense. It's, I don't know. I don't know. That's all I have to say about it. It's very confusing why this was even put on there. Next up, we have Avalanche, formerly known as Earthquake, and future to be known as the Shark and Golga, going up against the man called Sting. This was a decent match. Sting gets a win by disqualification when Kevin Sullivan comes out and attacks. There's 2 ref bumps by Avalanche. Hogan comes down, makes a save. It's just a weird sequence for a night. Starrcade, with as much as Starrcade had meant before this and as much as it would mean after this, it was weird seeing so many disqualifications and matches that mean nothing on the show. I mean, this ultimately was a nothing match other than Sullivan and Avalanche and the Butcher had formed the Faces of Fear, and Sting was standing up with his friend Hulk Hogan to go up against them. Other than that, who cared about this match? Avalanche was 4 years past where he was a main event talent. Not saying that he wasn't still worth a spot on the card or he wasn't a good wrestler. I'm a fan of him when he was Earthquake. I thought he was at his best at that time. I liked him when he was Avalanche. I liked him when he was Shark. I just don't think that he should have been in one of the 3 main events at this point. Maybe switch him and Vader. We would have had a different show altogether. Vader vs. Sting always did well. And last but not least, the main event of the night, The Butcher, a.k.a. Brutus Beefcake, a.k.a. the Boogeyman, a.k.a. the Disciple, a.k.a. Brother Brutai, the man they couldn't decide on a name for, even at one point called him the Man with No Name, going up against Hulk Hogan. This is all brought on by the fact that Kevin Sullivan has talked the Butcher into turning on his best friend Hogan, which sets up a main event for Starrcade. Starrcade main event. Not No Way Out, not some throwaway pay-per-view. Starrcade main event of The Butcher versus Hulk Hogan. Hogan picks up the win. Avalanche and Sullivan came out and attack. And throughout the whole show, they're mentioning the fact that Randy Savage is going to show up. And he's either going to slap Hogan in the face or shake Hulk Hogan's hand. We don't know what he's going to do. Savage comes down, seems to join with Sullivan and Butcher and Avalanche. Lets them get in front of him. Then attacks from behind. Shakes Hogan's hand. He's on Team Hogan. This would have been a great Monday Nitro main event for Starrcade. And I keep wanting to emphasize this, that this is Starrcade. This is WCW and NWA's WrestleMania. This is their Super Bowl. This is their World Series. This is the most important show of their year. And on the show, the main event is The Butcher and Hulk Hogan. If you look up and down the card, it has Hulk Hogan. You might as well call it Hulkcade. You have all of Hogan's friends, some good, some bad. You have Duggan on the show. You got the Nasty Boys, Avalanche, Mr. T, the Butcher, Randy Savage. This was full-on Hulkamania in WCW. Now, if that wasn't bad enough, we get to the Hogan's dressing room where he's celebrating with the faces, and in storms Big Van Vader. Again, would have been a great ending to a Monday Night Raw. They have a pool apart. You tune in next week, see what's going to happen with Hogan and Vader. Alas, it's a pool apart at the end of Starrcade. Hence why I think it's a terrible thing. Anytime that Starrcade could be compared to a Monday Nitro, did I just call it Monday Night Raw a couple minutes ago? I may have. If I did, I'm sorry. Anytime you could compare this to Monday Nitro, where I don't even think there was Nitro at this point. I think it was still the Saturday Night Show, Saturday Main Event, or the Sunday Power Hour, or whatever they were. I believe it was Saturday. Saturday was a Main Event, and I believe Sunday was Power Hour. Don't get me wrong, if I'm wrong on names, I do apologize. It's been several years since either of the shows aired. But it just felt like a glorified syndicated show or a glorified Monday Nitro, even though Nitro wasn't around, for Starrcade. And it was rather disappointing. The matches that could have happened, Hogan versus Flair, Savage versus Flair, Sting versus Savage, Vader versus Savage. I mean, you had so many potential great matches and such a great card you could have put together. Kevin Sullivan versus Hulk Hogan I thought would have been more interesting than Butcher versus Hogan. But they didn't. They gave us what they gave us. And that's going to lead me right into the ratings for the show. Now, we have a 1 to 5 scale. 1 is the worst, 5 is the best. 1 is a gobbledygooker, 2 is a renegade, 3 is a Hurricane Helms, 4 is a Goldust, and 5 is a King. Now, if you noticed, it's all kind of silly gimmicks and how successful they were. I'm going to give the show a 1, a gobbledygooker. I honestly think this is one of the worst Starrcades ever. The Hulk Hogan star power and Hulk Hoganized show didn't help. It just was bad. I mean, you had Sting on here, you had Big Van Vader, you had Booker T, Arn Anderson, some of the great wrestlers of the decade, Randy Savage, and you give us this crap fest. But basically that's what I have to say about that. I give it a 1, a gobbledygooker, just all in all a bad show. I don't recommend watching this unless you have to watch every WCW thing again, or you just like watching bad wrestling, which I seem to enjoy myself. So, basically that's all I have to say about that. My name is George Coles, and this has been another episode of It Came From the Network.